I was talking with some of my colleagues at work yesterday, and what came up in conversation was this, actually I can't remember how it came up in conversation, but something was talking about duende, which is a term that features in Lorca, the poet Lorca. And duende is, I haven't come across the term myself, so I'm going to find out more about it, but it's Lorca's term for a kind of, what is it? Well, it's a kind of poetic energy, life force, spirit kind of aspect of personality or way of being, that kind of thing. But duende, as it was explained to me, is understood as a kind of substance. At least that's the kind of language that revolves around it. It's an aspect of being, or it's a way of being, or it's a part of one's personality, or it's part of one's emotional state. That's what it is. But it's understood and discussed in terms of as if it was a kind of substance. And duende in particular is understood as a kind of dark substance, a dark, quite thick, viscous, almost chthonic kind of substance. I think it's compared to something like bitumen at one point in the writing. And that got me thinking about other kinds of substances that are used metaphorically to conceptualize and talk about mental states or ways of being or ways of seeming, ways of feeling, those kind of abstract aspects of being which can't be either conceived or communicated directly, but only through the application of some kind of conceptual metaphor. And substance metaphors seem to feature extensively, I think consistently across those, with duende being an example. But other things that I've come across are things like ectoplasm, which is kind of the most literal, I guess, which was very popular amongst late 19th century spiritualists and table tappers and mediums as this kind of literal life force that would emanate from people during seances and hypnotic trances. And it was kind of liquid, viscous, semi-vaporous sometimes, and it would kind of it could be like drawn out of people's mouths like a stream. It would congeal on things. So there's another kind of, but certainly in the pictures I've seen, there's a lot of fake photographs of ectoplasm. It's always kind of brightly coloured, or white or grey, or that kind of silvery, smoky colour. And it's clearly light. It's not dark in the way that duende is dark. And there's one called muelos, I think, which for me relates a little bit to ectoplasm, which features in some South American writing I've come across, which is usually associated with something like semen. But it's a kind of generative fluid, part of the kind of virility and and a kind of life force of human beings. But it's, as I said again, it's not literally semen. It's conceived of as being kind of like that, really. And again, that's a little bit like ectoplasmic in its characteristics. It's light, it's viscous, has those kind of qualities. Other kinds of fake substances or metaphorical substances. I think you also get into things like Bergson's elan vital, life force, which is barely a substance at all, really. It's talked of as if it's a force, but in some of the writings around elan vital and kind of life forces more generally, things like the vril energy that comes up in some of what's it called? I can't remember. Some writings by some science fiction writer of the late 19th, wasn't science fiction, but that kind of imaginative writing in the late 19th century, vril, or other various kind of energetics that feature, bioenergetics that features in different traditions, has again, it has a kind of substantive quality. It's conceived of and talked about as a kind of substance, but in those cases it's quite vaporous, quite almost translucent or transparent in some cases. But I guess the most general term for that being something like spirit, which has this really odd double meaning, certainly in English, where it partly means spirit to do with some kind of ghost or angel, but also it has this meaning to do with things like methylated spirits, or how spirits used to be used in chemistry, which is this kind of volatile substance, a substance which exists as a liquid, but barely. It has this tendency to transform into a gas spontaneously under right conditions. It expands and rises and turns transparent, or is transparent already. It's like right on the brink of intangibility, or crosses the boundary between tangibility and intangibility when we're starting to talk about spirit. So again, it's a metaphorical substance, albeit an almost ethereal comes from ether, doesn't it? Because almost ethereal or ephemeral substance, but on a sliding scale of substances that also contains things like ectoplasm, things like moelos, things like elan, vital, or vril, or any of those kind of terms, and also things like duende. Yeah. So there seems to be a whole series of substances which are used in a relatively consistent way to talk about, think about mental states, ways of being, ideas to do with consciousness and cognition more generally. But obviously you can't talk about those or think about those directly, so we think about them in terms of particular substances. I think one interesting crossover point is that certainly some of the conferences I've been to, and the conference I'm going to this afternoon, there's this weird little crossover where substances or ideas, substantive ideas, metaphorical ideas like duende, have a strange kind of bleed into ideas drawn from certain aspects of physics. So I've heard, for example, conference papers which talk about, which in another context we'll be talking about, say theatrical presence, for example. We'll be talking about theatrical presence in terms of duende or in terms of spirit, but are kind of mobilizing the language of physics instead. So exotic physical substances like dark matter or dark energy, or that kind of again metaphorical substance is mobilized rather than the literally poetic substances of Lorca and Bergson and the rest.